Religion is a big part of the world building and storytelling in a lot of fictional universes. Think the Fremen's prophetic religion in Dune, the complex pantheon in the Elder Scrolls series, or the goddess worship in The Legend of Zelda. But in a lot of these stories, the religions feel more like set dressings than something people actually live and breathe. For example, let's look at the religions in the Game of Thrones series, which has always left me wishing for a bit more depth. George R.R. Martin wrote a bunch of competing religions into his story. The nameless old gods of the north, the fiery lord of light from across the sea, and of course the Faith of the Seven, the dominant religion in much of Westeros. The Faith of the Seven is presented like a copy and paste of the medieval Catholic Church in Europe. You have a unified hierarchical clergy, the High Septon sitting at the top like the Pope, and a network of septs across the continent like a network of dioceses. And that's not a coincidence. Martin himself has said in interviews that he modeled the Faith of the Seven after the Catholic Church. And in both the books and the show, this creates a religion that feels coherent and grounded, which works for the kind of political storytelling that Martin wants to tell. But religion in the series also feels a little too tidy. Each culture basically has one god or pantheon neatly mapped onto their geographical region. Now, that makes it easy for us to follow as viewers and readers, but compared to the chaotic reality of real-world religions, it feels thin. Real-world religions fracture. They absorb bits and pieces from their neighbors. Beliefs and practices shift from one culture to the next. They can shift from one village to the next. And the official rules, doctrines, and mythologies often have little to do with what ordinary people actually do with their religion on the ground. Just look at the Catholic Church, which is a lot more complex in reality than its fictional counterpart. You not only have variations across cultures, like the differences between Catholicism in Ireland versus the Philippines versus Mexico, but you also have political disputes, like conservative and progressive Catholics debating climate action or women's ordination. There's also folk Catholic movements, like the devotion to Santa Muerte in Mexico, which official Catholic authorities have outright rejected. And in other cases, Catholic symbols and saints have been woven into entirely new religions, like Haitian Vodou. And these are just examples that exist within one global religion. Now, I get it. Most authors and showrunners are not trying to perfectly recreate the messy reality of religion in the world building. They have other priorities. Move the plot forward, flesh out the characters, evoke a certain design language. But here's the thing. Even in the more elaborate fictional religions, the ones with rich histories, multiple factions, and detailed rituals, these still tend to miss some of the core characteristics of real-world religions. And those missing pieces are a goldmine for making a fictional universe feel alive, complex, and grounded. So in this video, I want you to imagine that you're building a religion for your fantasy or sci-fi world. And I'm going to give you 4 things that every single real-world religion does, but most fictional world religions miss. Number 1, syncretism, which can mean something like religious mixing, assimilation, or hybridity. If you want your fictional religion to feel real, show how it absorbs and adapts the cultures around it. In the past, syncretism was often imagined as 2 discrete religious systems merging and creating something new, almost like 2 plants crossbreeding into a hybrid. But more recent scholarship sees it as an ongoing process of people negotiating with the cultures around them. In late Roman Egypt, for example, when Christianity first started making its way into the region, indigenous Egyptians shaped it, reshaped it, and made it their own. Egyptian Christian villagers might have kept an ancestral altar in their home while at the same time displaying a cross over their doorway. On Sunday, they might have participated in church liturgy, while on Monday, they might have visited a local oracle for divination and guidance, or maybe even celebrate a traditional festival that used to honor an Egyptian god, but now honors a Christian saint. This amulet here is another example of syncretism from the ancient Mediterranean. It's a bronze disc dating from around the 3rd century CE discovered in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey. Now, this is the best drawing I could find, so let me walk you through it, because it looks kind of messy. On one side, you can see the Greek moon goddess and sun god, and a lion trampling a demonic figure while attacking the evil eye. The Jewish and Christian liturgical phrase, holy, 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 is squeezed above and between the gods. On the other side, you can see a saint on a horse spearing the same demon, while an angel stands before him. A Greek inscription is around the edge. Angel Araph, flee, O hated one, Solomon pursues you. So here we see a mix of Greco-Roman religion and Jewish and Christian symbolism. Apparently, someone in late Roman Anatolia saw this particular blend of divine figures, liturgical phrases, and protective imagery as an especially efficacious way to protect themselves from harm. So what religion did this person follow, whoever commissioned or wore this amulet? Well, pinning down their exact religious affiliation might be impossible, and maybe it's beside the point. Throughout the history of religion, no one has ever received a religion fully formed. Scribes, artisans, holy men, priests, priests, mothers, shepherds, all people are constantly tinkering with religious materials, picking up new symbols, adapting rituals, and mixing traditions in ways that make sense in their own homes, workshops, and local shrines. You see a similar process in Haitian Vodou, which I already mentioned. Enslaved Africans in the Caribbean brought with them a wide range of West and Central African religious traditions. Under colonial rule in Haiti, they were pressured, sometimes violently, to adopt Catholicism, but they didn't simply abandon their traditional beliefs and practices. They adapted them. For example, Catholic saints were identified with Vodou spirits called Loa, like the Virgin Mary being identified with Azili Dantor or St. Patrick being identified with Damballa. Catholic feast days also became occasions for Vodou ceremonies. These are acts of bricolage, a term from the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss meaning the creative reuse and recombination of whatever cultural materials are at hand. Bricolage is basically the French word for do-it-yourself, so syncretism can be seen as DIY religion, an ongoing, unfinished, and sometimes contested process in which people make decisions about which practices to keep, which practices to adopt, and which ones to reject, often in dialogue with or in defiance of religious authorities. Okay, I know that's a lot to throw at you if all you wanted was, make my fantasy religion more realistic, but you don't need to replicate an entire religious studies PhD seminar to make syncretism work in your world building. Start small. Give a village a harvest festival that began in honor of one god but is now dedicated to another god. Show a sacred symbol that means one thing in one culture but has been adopted into a completely different culture. Let your characters casually borrow or rework a prayer from a neighboring city, or carry an amulet from an old religion while following a new one. Even a few details like this can make your fictional religion feel lived in, layered, and syncretized. Next, I'd love to see more attention paid to ritual or ritualization, which I'll define shortly. In a lot of fantasy and sci-fi series, it's abundantly clear that the writers have poured enormous effort into creating grand mythologies in their fictional religion. The sweeping creation stories, the rivalries between different gods in the pantheon, or the apocalyptic prophecies. Examples would include the Wheel of Time's detailed cosmology of the Creator and the Dark One, or the extremely elaborate god lore in the Elder Scrolls games. But here's the thing, in real life, most religious practitioners are not walking around thinking about those myths. Okay, yes, myths and religious stories are very important to religion. They explain why holidays happen, justify certain practices, and are used for moral teachings. Just as a quick example, almost every part of the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca is tied to a story from Islamic tradition. Like how the stoning of the devil ritual symbolizes Abraham rejecting the temptations of Satan. But for most people, lore, mythology, or stories fade into the background of daily life. They are far less immediate than the prayers, offerings, and routines that actually structure their religious practice. In other words, religious practitioners are far more concerned with what they do than with the finer points of theology or mythology. And I get it, truly. I love mythological lore as much as the next nerd. I still get chills from the creation myth cutscene in the Ocarina of Time, in all its original N64 glory. But what I'd really love to see is writers pouring as much creative energy into rituals as they do into sweeping creation stories. Spoilers ahead for Apple TV's Foundation series, but I was legitimately impressed by the portrayal of a pilgrimage in Season 1, Episode 8. So in this episode, the clone emperor discards his protective nanotech and walks a blazing desert pilgrimage known as the Spiral, which ends at a cave called the Mother's Womb, where pilgrims believe they'll receive a vision. Now, I won't spoil too much, but the showrunners came up with believable rules about how you're allowed to finish the pilgrimage. And when the emperor finally completes the journey, his return sparks a political and religious fallout. What I really liked about this episode was not only the creativity of the ritual, but how the showrunners used ritual to shape the characters and the politics. It wasn't really a flashy spectacle, but it was embodied, raw, symbolic, and it drove the plot forward. I think part of the reason why we see so much focus on sweeping mythological lore in fictional worlds comes from how Western culture has been conditioned to think about religion in the first place. We are so conditioned to think of religion as essentially something grounded in sacred texts, and the myths and doctrines recorded in those texts. That assumption runs deep in societies shaped by Christianity, and especially Protestant Christianity, where authority has long been tied to sola scriptura. When that's your starting point, it's easy to treat a religion's text as the religion itself, and to imagine that if you can summarize what is written in that text, you've captured the essence of that tradition. But in many traditions, sacred texts are really not all that central. There's more of a focus on orthopraxy, or correct practices, rather than orthodoxy, or correct teachings. So what can an author do with this? The anthropologist Catherine Bell argued that it's not really useful to think of ritual as a category of behavior. After all, that one-term ritual can apply to everything from state funerals to Buddhist prayer wheels, from a Passover Seder to a baseball player's batting stance. It's an impossibly huge category of behavior. Instead, she argues it's better to think of ritual as a process, the process of ritualization. Ritualization is a process of transforming ordinary actions like walking, eating, or pouring water into something special, which can be done through repetition, symbolism, or a formalized structure. You name it, there's a lot of ways to transform an ordinary action into something extraordinary. It's not the bare act itself that makes something a religious ritual, it's the way it's framed, repeated, or set apart. Like a procession is just a bunch of people walking together until you walk together in a certain order, on a certain day, with certain objects and words, like the processions you see walking through the old city of Jerusalem around Easter. In real-world religions, this process of ritualization is everywhere. The Eucharist ritualizes eating bread and drinking wine. At a Shinto shrine, worshippers ritualize hand-washing before entering a shrine. This separates ordinary space from the sacred space of the shrine. So what I'd love to see in more fictional universes is more ritualization. Not only creativity in inventing the rituals, but stories where ceremonies, initiations, and seasonal festivals are given the same narrative weight as a creation myth. Next, your world building should pay attention to religious materiality, religious stuff. Like I said earlier, Western frameworks are often biased to think of religion fundamentally as a set of beliefs, stories, or moral codes, especially those written down in texts. But religion also involves physical materials. Temples and shrines, incense and candles, statues, figurines, and icons, special clothing, holiday foods, prayer beads, and prayer wheels. Scholars in recent decades have been paying a lot of attention to religious materiality, studying how religion is expressed, maintained, and experienced through physical things, and they've been doing this in part because people over-focus on texts and beliefs. So for example, consider Hindu devotional statues of gods. The anthropologist Vinita Sinha found that in Singapore, shop owners selling statues of Hindu gods deliberately avoid products marked made in China, preferring ones that are made in India. For many Singaporean Hindus, India remains central in their minds as the most legitimate and preferred site for all things Hindu. And entrepreneurs in Singapore respond to this by sourcing devotional items from India. It's just good business sense. And from this one example, we can learn a ton about a diaspora religious community. In Singapore, Hindu devotional statues carry layers of meaning tied to where and how they're made. In other words, a single purchase at a shop counter can reflect centuries of tradition, contemporary identity politics, and the economics of religious life at once. Even for religious traditions that claim to have less focus on materiality, there's still a whole lot of material culture if you know where to look. American evangelicalism, for example, isn't usually associated with ornate cathedrals, incense, or clerical vestments like Catholic or Orthodox Christianity, but evangelicalism in the 1990s definitely had its own material culture. Illustrated children's books, WWJD bracelets, Salty the Singing Songbook cassette tapes, and yes, VeggieTales. For world builders, especially costume designers, prop makers, and visual storytellers, thinking in terms of material religion can develop a unique and believable design language for your setting. If your fictional culture has religious beliefs, what physical objects embody them? What fabrics, jewelry, tools, or architectural details carry religious significance? When a viewer sees a character holding prayer beads or spinning a prayer wheel or putting on a specific garment, they instantly learn something about that world's religion without a single line of exposition. Another thing I rarely see in fictional universes is something that scholars call lived religion. This is how religion is practiced, experienced, and expressed by ordinary people rather than official spokespersons. So, for example, if I asked you, what do Christians do and believe, you might think of the official items on the checklist. Go to some sort of communal worship or liturgical experience on Sundays, read the Bible, pray to God, usually envisioned as a trinity, engage in rituals like the Eucharist and baptism, and celebrate holidays like Easter and Christmas. Of course, there's a lot of variation across the different branches of Christianity, but these are some of the textbook answers. And they're not wrong, they're just not the whole story. In real life, people's religious worlds often don't follow textbook definitions, because people fold all kinds of everyday habits, folk traditions, and personal rituals into their religious lives. You can see this in the rising popularity of manifesting and essential oils among American Christians. Manifesting is the idea that by focusing your thoughts and visualizing a desired outcome, and maybe even speaking it out loud, you can attract it into your life, a concept that has roots in New Age spirituality and the self-help movement. Essential oils, on the other hand, are concentrated plant extracts that are also popular in the New Age movement. These are not exactly official Christian practices, and some Christian authorities have spoken out against them, like this recent article from a Christian magazine saying that manifesting has infiltrated American Christian culture. In the early 2000s, bunches of instructional books were published aimed at Christian audiences praising the biblical significance of essential oils. Many claim that scenting one's Bible study with frankincense or sandalwood could deepen the experience of the text. And manifesting, often framed in secular self-help language, has been reinterpreted by many Christians as aligning your thoughts with God's will, or praying with expectation and speaking blessings into being. None of this shows up in a catechism or a doctrinal statement, but for the Christians doing these practices, they consider them as part of their Christian life. And these practices don't need to be logically consistent with official Christian teachings. They just need to work. And by work, I don't mean stand up to theological scrutiny. I mean, does this ritual, object, or action make my life better? Does it help heal my cousin's illness or get me that promotion at work? The scholar Robert Orsi gives another example. American Catholics at St. Lucy's Church in the Bronx would sometimes bring home bottles of water from a neighborhood shrine built to look like the grotto at Lourdes in France, even though they knew perfectly well it was just New York City tap water. Meredith McGuire, a leading scholar in the field of lived religion, says we are mistaken in our expectation of cognitive consistency between individuals' religion, as institutionally framed, and a person's actual religion, as lived. It may be only intellectuals who care about rational coherence in religious ways of thinking, perceiving, and acting. After nearly 40 years of talking to people about their individual religions, I have the impression that only a small and unrepresentative proportion struggle to achieve tight consistency among their wide-ranging beliefs, perceptions, experiences, values, practices, and actions. I very rarely see examples of lived religion in fiction. Now, we hear a lot about what official sources say about a religion, but I want to see authors and showrunners deciding what a world's farmers, merchants, and street vendors actually do with that religion on the ground. You know, the little rituals, the personal priorities, the things that might make the elites roll their eyes, but that everybody does anyway. The difference between a flat, schematic religion and one that feels real often comes down to these unofficial, improvised, and deeply personal ways that people actually do their religion in their daily lives. So those are just a few examples of what I rarely ever see in religions and fictional universes. Again, I'm not expecting an author or showrunner to replicate a bunch of religious studies theory and method in their stories. That would be boring, as much as I love religious studies theory and method. But these are features of religion that I see all over the world and all throughout history, and it would be really cool to see some world builders step up and do something very different with their fictional religion. And honestly, this kind of critical thinking, asking why things look the way they do, what's being shown, and what's being left out, is not just useful when analyzing religion, it's just as important when we're looking at the real world, especially when it comes to the news. That's why I've been using ground news. Ground news is the thing that you wish you had the time and energy to do every time you scrolled through the headlines on your social feeds, having the ability to compare coverage across the political spectrum, track who's reporting what and how they're framing the story. But instead of spending your whole day doing that, Ground News does it for you. Ground News is a website and app that aggregates a bunch of different outlets covering a particular story, and then pairs that story with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting. Right now, one of the top stories is about the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth reposting a video featuring an evangelical pastor saying women should not be allowed to vote. Here, Ground News has aggregated literally hundreds of outlets covering this story. Scroll down here and you can see the bias distribution chart. Most of the coverage is coming from the center, with about a third coming from left-leaning sources and a small minority from right-leaning sources. Scroll down again and here's the factuality chart. The overwhelming majority of these sources have been rated as highly factual. And here's the ownership chart, showing you who owns these sources, including wealthy private owners, private equity, or media conglomerates. Ground News also enables you to easily compare headlines. The right-wing Washington Times reads, Hegseth reposts video on social media featuring pastors saying women shouldn't be allowed to vote, while the left-leaning New Republic infers Hegseth's intention. It sure looks like Pete Hegseth doesn't think women should vote. One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed. It highlights stories that are heavily covered on one side of the political spectrum but ignored on the other side. So if a story is blowing up in right-leaning media but barely mentioned on the left, or vice versa, you'll see it right there in the feed. It's a quick way to check what you're missing, and it can also reveal a ton about what each side considers to be newsworthy. Now, we can't get rid of bias completely, but Ground News gives you the tools to see the bias, see the gaps, and understand why some stories blow up in one media bubble and vanish in another. If that sounds like something you'd like to use, head on over to ground.news/religion for breakfast, or scan the QR code here on screen to get 40% off their Vantage plan. Again, that's ground.news/religion for breakfast. Thanks, everyone.